Hey there, it's Schmitty again with another Star Wars Armada Tactics video. As always, thanks for watching and appreciate all the comments I get. Today I want to talk about a situation you guys will often see when you're playing games for Armada, and that's where, I don't know if you've seen this, but you'll be playing a game and after it's over, you'll say, wow, that one was just over from deployment. You know, it's like, basically from the get-go, you could tell one side just didn't have a chance. Now, sometimes that's a mismatched fleet base, but frequently it's just one player is just in so much stronger a position at deployment that it's pretty obvious who's going to win. Okay, and I think a lot of people don't necessarily always give the thought to deployment that they should. I know when I'm playing casual games, I usually just kind of throw my ships out there and see what happens, but when you have a plan, especially if you're thinking of setting up a kill zone, working with a particular formation, it's important, I think, to have a good, strong idea of how you can deploy. I think too often I see players that will just basically, I'm going to put all my squads here in a clump in front of me, I'm going to put my ships in a line as far as they can in the deployment zone, and go from there. And I'm like, there is a lot more you can do with deployment. So I'm going to go over a few of the options today and hopefully give you guys some new ideas for what we can do. Okay, so I'm going to start today by showing you a little bit of a scenario, a deployment problem I had to figure out pretty early on in playing Armada. Early on I really took to broadside fleets. That's not like a big secret or anything. I enjoy the whole gun line concept, and the goal was, get yourself where you can have two ships set up with nice broadside shots at the same target. And what I found as I started playing with assault frigates especially was, if I had it set up right, it was actually possible to leapfrog the back ship in front of the third ship with a nav command at speed 3, which was super useful and something my opponents wouldn't expect. But I couldn't get that way unless they were set just right on the turn I wanted to do it, and in order to get there I really had to be deployed correctly. And so I had to work at figuring out, okay, how do I get my ships deployed so that I'm in position for that sort of leapfrog maneuver? The other thing that I figured out playing broadside fleets is sometimes it's just not enough firepower to take out your target. So I started using a trailer where I would bring like Salvation or some other smaller forward-firing ship in from the side to kind of work in and supplement my firepower of my line. Well, I also had to play with where was the right spot to deploy that so that it would time out arriving when and where I needed it to with some flexibility. And so what I figured out was I had to kind of fast forward the game and think about, okay, where do I want to be on turn 3? Where do I want to be on turn 4? And then move my ships backwards at the average speed I think they would be going and see where I ended up for deployment. And by doing that, I could deploy myself in a really strong position. So what I figured out was, if I'm deploying, I would deploy, my first ship in my conga line, I would deploy pretty far out in neutral, and then the second one I could kind of deploy in right there, and it could sort of swing in behind. And depending on how my opponent deployed, I could put it in on the other side and sort of do the same thing. The other piece was, I found out that if I really wanted to make this work with that neb, I actually had to have it almost a full range ruler away. What that did is it gave me time to move out and start to make a wider turn, which gave me options so that when I would get up here, I could have it go to the front of the line, through the middle, or to the back, depending on where that firepower was needed. But in order to do that, I really had to have that correct spacing on my deployment. So as I was learning how to fly this way, learning how to play this, I learned that I needed the right spacing in my deployment. I needed to deploy this way to set myself up for later in the turn. So really the first thing you really need to know about deployment is, where do you want to be halfway through the game? And then how do you deploy to be successful in that position? Okay, I'm going to switch over to the other side of the camera and talk about a couple other just general principles we can work with. Okay, so as I was saying, when thinking about how you want to deploy, you really want to think about where is it you want to be a couple turns into the game and set yourself up to get there, but in a flexible enough situation, you've got some flexibility with that. Often I see people, they just take their stuff, deploy it in a row, put your squadrons out front, and it's fairly easy to counter. So you've got a full area of depth here in your deployment zone. You can use it. You've got tons of width. You can use that as well. The thing is, you can deploy spread, but plan on being converged when you get there. Okay. A little bit about deployment order. there's a couple ways to go about this. One of the first things you probably want to do, know how many deployments you have in your fleet. Okay. Then when you set up to play, especially in a competitive match, figure out how many deployments does your opponent have. Okay. So now you've got to consider, are you out deployed or do you have more deployments? And that being first and second player can go into that. I'll see a lot of people do things like this. It's hilarious. It's like, okay, I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to put this here, and I'm going to put those squadrons there, and I'm going to put this here, and I'm holding the Star Destroyer because I'm going to deploy it last, but really, where do you think it's going to go? They're setting it up to go right there. There's no surprise. So if you're holding a piece to deploy late and waiting for your opponent to commit some stuff, it needs to be something you're not planning on deploying in the middle of your formation. Pieces like Demolish or Admonition, these are great for holding until later. Even just a flanker like a CR90 is great for holding till later when you know you want to get on the flank. Architens work great for that. So I see a lot of people will hold their most powerful piece till late, but they still kind of telegraph where it's going to end up. Unexpected deployments mess with people. It's a good thing to do. Now, if I know I'm out deployed, I frequently take my most powerful piece and I drop it first. Because I can usually, if I, kind of gauge the style of fleet my opponent's playing, I can drop it and more or less, by looking at the obstacles where I've placed that ship, narrow down where my opponent can put his ship in response. Really effective. So you can kind of cut sections of the board off and get your opponent to act in a predictable way. And I think that's better than trying to hold it till late. If you're out deployed anyway, take the initiative in deployment. Start dropping your strong pieces and force them to react to what you're doing, rather than trying to hold it till later when they're going to be able to, hold their deployments and out deploy you anyway. Okay. So think about spacing. Think about, okay, where do I want to be? How far apart can I put myself where I don't have to worry about one side of my formation to the other getting out deployed, still get into that supporting position for each other when the game gets going. But if I deploy too close, yeah, I'm in that supporting position. My ships can support each other with fire, but I've locked down my movement options. If I deploy with a little more space, but with a plan of closing as the game progresses, I still have my deployment options, but I'm not locked out of it at the beginning. My number one rule for deploying is for maneuvering, is how can I make my opponent get in his own way, okay? And if you deploy yourself really tightly together, it's really easy to do that. So think about where you want to be, deploy there. Use the whole depth, use some width. It's really easy to deploy ships about one range ruler apart, and within a couple turns, have them in a position where they can be mutually supporting each other with fire. Think about the speed you're deploying at. Try to deploy at a rather neutral speed. Speed 2 is a great idea. You nav the first turn, you can go up to 3, you can go down to 1. I know a lot of people like to deploy at a certain speed and bank a nav token their first turn. I think it gives a lot away. And it's like, oh wow, you're coming at me speed 3 right off the bat. It's like, well, I know you're going to be aggressive. You're holding back at speed 1. I know I've got time. Speed 2 does not give near as much information away. Another thing to consider as you're playing. Depth is okay, just like width is okay, depth is okay. It's okay to have some depth in your formations. Use that when you deploy. Have some depth back here, and send one ship up at one speed, the others kind of slowly tagging on, or these can speed up and catch up, however you want to do. But the more flexibility you give yourself in your deployment, the more choices you have later. Armada is a game where you need those options as you're maneuvering to react to what your opponent does. I think a lot of times you can deploy yourself out of having the options that you need. Now, sometimes I do deploy it closer than others. If I know that I'm playing, for instance, heavy squads, I tend to deploy myself a little bit tighter so I've got overlapping fire arcs with my flak. If I think I'm playing something a little more mobile with ships, I'll give myself a little more space. Still wary of getting outnumbered on one side or the other, but I want the space, especially for these big ships. You want to give them the space that they can do a full turn. Get your maneuver tool out, see how far they can move, make sure they've got the space to do it. So it's this real dichotomy of giving yourself enough space to move, but staying close enough to support each other that you've got to really set up when you're deploying. Okay, well that was just another quick one on deployment. I'll probably come back and revisit this topic again in a future date. But again, think about when you're deploying. Where do you want to be in 3 or 4 turns? How can you deploy in a position to set yourself up to get there? You don't have to start in the formation you want to be in. You have to end up there. So how can you deploy giving yourself enough space for flexible maneuver to get where you want to be for that mid-game and not telegraph it? You know, if you're just bunching up right from the beginning, it really telegraphs where you're going to be and makes it really easy on your opponent. So how can you spread some things out, use that depth and width of your deployment zone, still end up where you want to be when you get there, and have the flexibility to really maneuver and react to how the game is flowing. Alright, well, let me know what you think in the comments. If you have suggestions, other things you'd like me to cover, feel free to comment on that as well. And thanks as always for watching. Bye.